The antique shop was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, its windows fogged with age and its door creaking on hinges that had seen better days. Eleanor had always been drawn to places like this, places where time seemed to stand still, where the past whispered secrets to those who were willing to listen. She had been wandering the narrow aisles for what felt like hours, her fingers brushing against dusty trinkets and forgotten relics, when she saw it. The mirror was tall, nearly as tall as she was, with an ornate frame carved from dark wood. The carvings were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change as she moved, as if they were alive. The glass itself was old, its surface slightly warped, but it still held a clarity that was almost unnerving. Eleanor felt a strange pull as she approached it, a sensation that made her heart beat faster and her palms sweat. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched the frame. The moment her skin made contact with the wood, a shiver ran down her spine. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and the light in the shop dimmed, as if the mirror itself was drawing the energy from the room. Eleanor's reflection stared back at her, but there was something off about it. Her eyes looked darker, her skin paler, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of movement behind her, like a shadow passing by. She shook her head, trying to dispel the strange feeling that had come over her. It was just an old mirror, after all. Probably just a trick of the light or her imagination running wild. But as she turned to walk away, something caught her eye. In the reflection, she saw herself lying on the ground, her eyes wide and unseeing, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Eleanor gasped and spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was nothing there, of course. The shop was empty, save for the old man behind the counter who was watching her with a curious expression. She forced a smile and walked over to him, trying to steady her breathing. "How much for the mirror?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The old man's eyes narrowed, and he studied her for a moment before answering. "That mirror is not for sale," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Eleanor frowned. "But it's in your shop. Surely everything here is for sale." The old man shook his head. "Not that one. It's cursed. Bad luck. You don't want it." Eleanor's curiosity was piqued. She had always been fascinated by the idea of cursed objects, the stories of haunted artifacts and malevolent spirits. She couldn't resist the challenge. "I'll take it," she said firmly. "Name your price." The old man hesitated, then sighed. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." He named a price that was far more than Eleanor had expected to pay, but she didn't care. She handed over the money, and the old man helped her carry the mirror out to her car. As they loaded it into the back seat, he gave her one last, lingering look. "Be careful," he said. "That mirror, it shows things. Things you might not want to see." Eleanor nodded, but she was already too excited to pay much attention to his warning. She drove home with the mirror safely secured in the back seat, her mind racing with possibilities. What had she seen in the reflection? Was it real or just her imagination? She couldn't wait to find out. When she got home, she carefully carried the mirror inside and set it up in her living room. It looked even more impressive in the light of her apartment, the carvings on the frame seeming to come alive as the shadows danced across them. She stood in front of it, staring at her reflection, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. Her reflection stared back at her, perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. But then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw it again. The same vision as before, only this time it was clearer. She saw herself lying on the ground, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide and empty. And this time she saw something else too, a figure standing over her, their face obscured by shadow. Eleanor stumbled back, her heart racing. She told herself it was just her imagination, just a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew it was real. The mirror had shown her something terrible. And she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a warning. Eleanor spent the rest of the evening trying to convince herself that what she had seen in the mirror was nothing more than a trick of her mind. She made herself a cup of tea, turned on the television, and tried to distract herself with the mundane routines of her life. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the image of her lifeless body lying on the ground, the shadowy figure looming over her. By the time she went to bed, her nerves were frayed. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What if the mirror was real? What if it truly showed her death? The thought was too terrifying to entertain, but it clung to her like a shadow, refusing to let go. Sleep came fitfully, and when it did, it brought nightmares. She dreamed of the mirror, its surface rippling like water, her reflection twisting and distorting until it no longer looked like her. She dreamed of the shadowy figure, their face always just out of view, their presence cold and menacing. And she dreamed of her own death over and over again, each time more vivid and horrifying than the last. When she woke the next morning, she was drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. She sat up in bed, clutching the sheets, and took several deep breaths to calm herself. It was just a dream, she told herself. Just a nightmare. But the memory of it lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She got out of bed and went to the living room, half expecting the mirror to be gone or to look different somehow. But it was exactly as she had left it, standing tall and imposing against the wall. She approached it cautiously, her heart racing, and stared at her reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, just as before, the image shifted. This time, the vision was different. She saw herself standing on a busy street, surrounded by people. She was wearing a coat she didn't own, and her hair was shorter than it was now. The scene was so vivid, so real, that she felt as if she were actually there. She watched as her reflection looked both ways before stepping off the curb. And then, out of nowhere, a car came speeding around the corner, its tires screeching. Her reflection turned, her eyes wide with terror, and then the vision ended abruptly, leaving Eleanor gasping for breath. She stumbled back from the mirror, her hands trembling. This was no trick of the light, no figment of her imagination. The mirror had shown her something real, something that hadn't happened yet. But how? How was this possible? She needed answers. She couldn't just sit here and wait for the visions to come true. She had to do something to find out more about the mirror and what it meant. But where to start? The old man in the antique shop had said the mirror was cursed. Maybe he knew more than he had let on. Eleanor grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind racing. The antique shop wasn't far, and she arrived within minutes. But when she pushed open the door and stepped inside, the old man was nowhere to be seen. In his place was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with bright red hair and a bored expression on her face. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, not looking up from the magazine she was reading. "I'm looking for the man who was here yesterday," Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The owner." The woman glanced up, her expression shifting slightly. "Oh, you mean Mr. Grayson? He's not here. He passed away last night." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What? How?" The woman shrugged. "Heart attack, I think. It was sudden. He was fine 1 minute and then... Well, you know." Eleanor's mind was reeling. Mr. Grayson was dead? Just like that? Couldn't be a coincidence. The mirror had shown her his death, hadn't it? Or was she just imagining things, connecting dots that weren't really there? Did he ever talk about a mirror? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A tall, antique mirror with carvings on the frame? The woman's eyes narrowed, and she set down her magazine. "Why do you ask?" Eleanor hesitated. She didn't want to sound crazy, but she needed answers. "I bought it from him yesterday, and now... strange things are happening." The woman studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't know much about it, but Mr. Grayson did say something about that mirror once. He said it was dangerous, that it had a history. He didn't like to talk about it." "A history?" Eleanor pressed. "What kind of history?" The woman shook her head. "I don't know. He never said. But if I were you, I'd get rid of it. Fast." Eleanor left the shop feeling more unsettled than ever. The mirror was dangerous, the woman had said. It had a history. But what kind of history? And why had Mr. Grayson died so suddenly after she had taken it? She needed to find out more. She couldn't just get rid of the mirror, not without knowing what she was dealing with. But where to start? The mirror had come from the shop, but Mr. Grayson was dead, and the woman who worked there didn't seem to know much. She needed to dig deeper. When she got home, she went straight to her computer and started searching. She typed in "antique mirror cursed" and "mirror shows death" and other variations, but nothing useful came up. Just urban legends and ghost stories, nothing that matched what she was experiencing. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the mirror. It stood there, silent and imposing, its surface reflecting the dim light of the room. She felt a strange pull, as if it was calling to her, urging her to look again. But she was afraid of what she might see. Finally, she couldn't resist. She stood up and walked over to the mirror, her heart pounding. She stared at her reflection, waiting for something to happen. At first, nothing did. But then, slowly, the image began to change. This time, the vision was different. She saw herself in a dark, unfamiliar room surrounded by old furniture and dusty boxes. She was holding something in her hands, a photograph. She couldn't see what was in the photo, but she could feel the weight of it, the importance. And then, just as before, the shadowy figure appeared, their face still obscured, their presence cold and menacing. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Eleanor gasping for breath. She stumbled back from the mirror, her mind racing. What did it mean? What was the dark room? And who was the shadowy figure? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. The mirror had shown her something, and she couldn't ignore it. She had to follow the clues, no matter where they led, even if it meant facing her worst fears. Eleanor spent the next few days in a state of restless determination. The mirror's visions had become more frequent, each one more vivid and unsettling than the last. She saw herself in different places, different situations, but the outcome was always the same: her death and the shadowy figure who seemed to be the cause of it. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to find out who the figure was and why they wanted her dead. Her first step was to research the mirror's history. She spent hours online, scouring antique forums, historical archives, and even obscure cult websites. She learned that mirrors had long been associated with superstition and the supernatural. In many cultures, they were believed to be portals to other worlds or tools for divination. But nothing she found explained the specific power of her mirror. Frustrated, she decided to take a different approach. She needed to find out who had owned the mirror before her. If she could trace its history, maybe she could find a pattern, a clue that would lead her to the truth. She started with the antique shop. The young woman who worked there had been unhelpful, but Eleanor was determined to get more information. She returned to the shop one afternoon, hoping to catch the woman in a more talkative mood. The shop was quiet when she arrived, the bell above the door jingling softly as she stepped inside. The red-haired woman was behind the counter, just as before, but this time she looked up with a faint smile. "Back again?" she asked, her tone more curious than bored. Eleanor nodded. "I need your help. I need to know more about the mirror I bought. Please, it's important." The woman studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I told you before, I don't know much about it. But there might be someone who does." Eleanor's heart leapt. "Who?" "Mr. Grayson's sister. She lives in the city. She might know something about the mirror. He used to talk to her about the shop, about the things he bought and sold. If anyone knows, it's her." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Do you have her address?" The woman hesitated, then scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to Eleanor. "Don't tell her I gave you this. And be careful. If the mirror is as dangerous as Mr. Grayson said, you don't want to mess with it." Eleanor took the paper and nodded. "Thank you. I'll be careful." She left the shop and headed straight for the address the woman had given her. It was an old apartment building in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place that had seen better days. She found the right apartment and knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a moment, the door opened, revealing an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a stern expression. "Yes," she asked, her voice clipped. "Are you Mr. Grayson's sister?" Eleanor asked. The woman's expression softened slightly. "I am. What do you want?" "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you about something your brother sold me." "A mirror. An antique mirror." The woman's eyes narrowed and she studied Eleanor for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Eleanor followed her into the apartment, which was cluttered with old furniture and knickknacks. The woman led her to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit down. "What do you want to know about the mirror?" the woman asked, her tone wary. "Everything," Eleanor said. "Your brother said it was cursed. He said it had a history. I need to know what that history is." The woman sighed and sat down across from Eleanor. "My brother was a superstitious man. He believed in curses, in ghosts, in all sorts of nonsense. But that mirror, there was something different about it. He bought it years ago from an estate sale. The previous owner had died under mysterious circumstances and the mirror was part of the estate. My brother thought it was valuable, so he bought it. But after he brought it home, strange things started happening." "What kind of things?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Visions," the woman said. "He said the mirror showed him things. Terrible things. He tried to sell it, but no one would take it. They said it was bad luck. So he kept it in the shop, hidden away until you came along." Eleanor's heart was racing. "Did he ever say what the visions were? What they showed?" The woman shook her head. "He didn't like to talk about it, but I know he was afraid of it. He said the mirror had a way of influencing people, of showing them things they didn't want to see." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you know who owned it before him? The person who died?" The woman hesitated. then stood up and walked over to a bookshelf. She pulled out an old photo album and flipped through it until she found what she was looking for. She handed Eleanor a photograph. "This is the man who owned the mirror before my brother," she said. "His name was Victor Hargrave. He was a collector like my brother, but he was also troubled. He died in a fire, along with his wife. The mirror was the only thing that survived." Eleanor stared at the photograph. It showed a man in his 50s with a stern face and cold eyes. She felt a strange sense of recognition, as if she had seen him before. But that was impossible. "Do you know anything else about him?" Eleanor asked. The woman shook her head. "Not much, but if you want to know more, you might try talking to his daughter. She lives in the city. Her name is Margaret Hargrave." Eleanor felt a surge of hope. "Do you have her address?" The woman hesitated, then wrote down an address and handed it to Eleanor. "Be careful," she said. "The mirror is dangerous, and so are the people connected to it." Eleanor took the address and nodded. "Thank you. I will." She left the apartment and headed straight for the address the woman had given her. It was a small house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a high fence. Eleanor knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a woman in her 30s with sharp features and cold eyes. She looked at Eleanor with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Yes?" she asked. "Are you Margaret Hargrave?" Eleanor asked. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" "My name is Eleanor. I need to talk to you about your father. About the mirror he owned." Margaret's expression darkened and she stepped back. "You'd better come in." Eleanor followed her into the house, which was dimly lit and sparsely furnished. Margaret led her to a small sitting room and gestured for her to sit down. "What do you want to know about the mirror?" Margaret asked, her tone guarded. "Everything," Eleanor said. "I bought it from an antique shop and now strange things are happening. I need to know what it is and why it's doing this." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "The mirror is cursed. It's been in my family for generations. My father was the last to own it and it killed him, just like it killed everyone else who owned it." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "The mirror shows you your death," Margaret said. "But it's not just a vision. It's a warning. And if you don't heed it, it will come true. My father saw his death in the mirror and he tried to change it. But in the end, he couldn't escape it. No one can." Eleanor's heart was racing. "But why? Why does it do this?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Because the mirror is alive. It feeds on fear, on despair. It shows you your death and then it makes sure it happens. It's a predator and we're its prey." Eleanor felt a surge of panic. "Is there any way to stop it? To break the curse?" Margaret shook her head. "No. Once the mirror has chosen you, there's no escape. The only thing you can do is accept it and prepare for the end." Eleanor's mind was reeling. She couldn't accept that. She couldn't just give up and wait for death. There had to be a way to fight it, to break the curse. But how? "Thank you," she said, standing up. I need to go." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good luck. You're going to need it." Eleanor left the house and headed back to her apartment, her mind racing. She couldn't give up. She had to find a way to break the curse, no matter what it took. But first, she needed to know more. She needed to find out who the shadowy figure was and why they wanted her dead. Eleanor returned to her apartment, her mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. Margaret's words echoed in her head. "The mirror is alive. It feeds on fear. It shows you your death and then it makes sure it happens." She couldn't accept that. She wouldn't. There had to be a way to fight back, to break the curse. But first, she needed to understand it. The shadowy figure from her visions was the key. Whoever or whatever they were connected to the mirror. They were the ones who would cause her death. If she could find out who they were, maybe she could stop them. She sat down at her computer and began searching for information about Victor Hargrave, the mirror's previous owner. She found an old newspaper article about the fire that had killed him and his wife. The article mentioned that the fire had been ruled an accident, but there were rumors of foul play. Some people believed that Victor had been involved in illegal activities and that the fire had been set to cover up his crimes. Eleanor's mind raced. If Victor had been involved in something dangerous, maybe the shadowy figure was someone from his past. Someone who had a grudge against him and now against anyone who owned the mirror. She needed to dig deeper. She searched for more information about Victor, but there wasn't much available. Frustrated, she turned her attention to the mirror itself. She examined it closely, looking for any clues that might reveal its origins. The carvings on the frame were intricate, but she couldn't make sense of them. They seemed to depict scenes of death and despair, but the details were too vague to interpret. As she studied the mirror, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the back of the frame, there was a small inscription, barely visible. She leaned in closer, squinting to read it. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, but they were accompanied by a symbol, a circle with a line through it, like a crossed-out sun. She took a photo of the inscription and uploaded it to an online translation forum, hoping someone might be able to identify the language. While she waited for a response, she decided to try something else. She had read that mirrors were often used in divination, in rituals to communicate with spirits. Maybe she could use the mirror to contact the shadowy figure directly. It was a risky idea, but she was desperate. She lit a candle and placed it in front of the mirror, then sat down and stared at her reflection. She focused on the shadowy figure, on the sense of dread they evoked. She whispered their name, or what she thought might be their name, under her breath. "Show yourself," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" At first, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the reflection in the mirror began to change. The room behind her grew darker, the shadows deeper. And then she saw it, the figure standing just behind her, their face still obscured. But this time, they were closer. Close enough to touch. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay still. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond, but she felt a cold presence, like a breath of icy air on the back of her neck. She shivered, but she didn't look away. She stared into the mirror, trying to see the figure's face. And then, for a brief moment, the shadows parted and she saw it. The face was familiar. It was Victor Hargrave. Eleanor gasped and stumbled back, breaking the connection. The mirror returned to normal, but the image of Victor's face lingered in her mind. Why had she seen him? Was he the shadowy figure? Or was he trying to warn her? Her computer chimed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She checked the translation forum and saw that someone had responded to her post. The inscription on the mirror was in Latin, they said. It read, "Mors certa, ora incerta." Death is certain, the hour is uncertain. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The mirror wasn't just showing her death. It was reminding her that it was inevitable. But she refused to accept that. If Victor was connected to the mirror, maybe he held the key to breaking the curse. She decided to visit the site of the fire that had killed Victor and his wife. It was a long shot, but she had to try. The house had been rebuilt, but maybe there were still clues to be found. The next day, she drove to the address she had found in the newspaper article. The house was a modern structure, with no trace of the fire that had destroyed the original building. She parked her car and walked around the property, looking for anything that might give her a clue. As she walked, she noticed an old shed at the back of the property. It looked like it had been there for years, untouched by the fire. She approached it cautiously, her heart racing. The door was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. She gave it a hard tug, and it broke off in her hand. Inside the shed, she found boxes of old belongings, covered in dust and cobwebs. She began to search through them, looking for anything related to Victor or the mirror. After several minutes, she found a box labeled Hargrave Estate. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found old photographs, documents, and personal items. She sifted through them, looking for anything that might help her. And then she found it. A journal, its pages yellowed with age. The name on the cover was Victor Hargrave. She opened the journal and began to read. The entries were written in a cramped, hurried hand, and many of them were difficult to decipher. But as she read, a pattern began to emerge. Victor had been obsessed with the mirror. He believed it was a powerful artifact, capable of granting its owner knowledge of the future. But he had also been afraid of it. He wrote about the visions he had seen, the deaths it had shown him. And he wrote about the shadowy figure. "The figure is always there," he wrote. "In every vision, in every death. I do not know who they are, but they are the key. They are the one who will bring about my end. And there is no escape." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words. Victor had seen the same figure she had, and he had believed that they were the one who would cause his death. But who were they? And why were they connected to the mirror? She flipped through the journal, looking for more clues. And then, she found something that made her blood run cold. On the last page, there was a drawing of the mirror with the same symbol she had seen on the back of the frame, the crossed-out sun. Beneath it, Victor had written a single word: Eternum. Eleanor didn't know what it meant, but it felt important. She took out her phone and searched for the word. It was Latin, she discovered. It meant eternal. The mirror was eternal. The curse was eternal. And the shadowy figure was eternal. She closed the journal and sat back, her mind racing. She was closer to the truth now, but she still didn't have all the answers. Who was the shadowy figure, and how could she stop them? As she sat there, a thought occurred to her. The mirror had shown her visions of her death, but it had also shown her other things. Clues, perhaps, that could help her break the curse. The dark room, the photograph, the crossed-out sun. Maybe they were pieces of a puzzle, and if she could put them together, she could find a way to escape her fate. She didn't know how, but she was determined to try. She couldn't give up. Not yet. Eleanor sat in the dim light of her apartment. Victor Hargrave's journal spread open on her lap. The words eternum and the crossed-out sun symbol haunted her thoughts. The mirror loomed in the corner of the room, its surface reflecting the flickering candlelight. She felt its presence like a weight on her chest, a constant reminder of the curse that hung over her. The visions had shown her a dark room, a photograph, and the shadowy figure. She needed to understand what they meant. If the mirror was giving her clues, she had to follow them, no matter how dangerous it might be. She flipped through the journal again, searching for any mention of the dark room or the photograph. Near the end, she found an entry that made her breath catch. The dark room is the key, Victor had written. It holds the truth, but it is not a place for the living. To enter is to risk everything. But if the mirror is to be defeated, it must be done. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words. The dark room wasn't just a vision. It was real, and Victor believed it was connected to the mirror's curse. But where was it, and how could she find it? She thought back to the vision she had seen in the mirror. The room had been filled with old furniture and dusty boxes, and she had been holding a photograph. If the room was real, it had to be somewhere tied to the mirror's history. Maybe it was in Victor's old house, the one that had burned down. But the house had been rebuilt, and the shed had yielded nothing but the journal. Then she remembered something Margaret Hargrave had said. The mirror has been in my family for generations. If the mirror was that old, maybe the dark room was somewhere else, somewhere tied to its original owner. She grabbed her laptop and began searching for information about the mirror's origins. It was a long shot, but she had to try. After hours of digging, she found a reference to an antique dealer who had specialized in cursed objects in the early 1900s. His name was Elias Blackwood, and he had been known for acquiring artifacts with dark histories. Eleanor's heart raced as she read about Blackwood. He had died under mysterious circumstances, and his collection had been sold off after his death. Among the items listed in the auction catalog was a large, ornate mirror with carvings of death and despair. It had to be the same mirror. She searched for more information about Blackwood and discovered that his estate had been turned into a museum after his death. The museum had closed decades ago, but the building was still standing, abandoned and crumbling. If the dark room existed, it might be there. The next morning, Eleanor drove to the address she had found. The Blackwood estate was on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling Victorian mansion surrounded by overgrown gardens and a rusted iron gate. The place looked like something out of a horror movie, but she didn't care. She had to find the dark room. She pushed open the gate, which creaked loudly on its hinges, and made her way up the overgrown path to the front door. The door was locked, but one of the windows was broken. She climbed through, careful not to cut herself on the jagged glass. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under her feet. She pulled out a flashlight and began to search the house, looking for anything that might lead her to the dark room. The first floor yielded nothing but empty rooms and broken furniture. She made her way upstairs, her heart pounding with every step. The second floor was just as empty, but as she turned a corner, she saw a door at the end of the hallway. It was different from the others, thicker, heavier, with a large, ornate lock. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This had to be it. She approached the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. She looked around for something to break the lock and found a rusted fire poker leaning against the wall. She grabbed it and swung it at the lock, again and again until it finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and descended the stairs. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and the walls seemed to close in around her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with dusty boxes and old books. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a photograph. Eleanor's heart raced as she approached the table. The photograph was old, faded with age, but she could still make out the image. It showed a group of people standing in front of the mirror, their faces solemn. In the center of the group was Elias Blackwood, his hand resting on the mirror's frame, and standing beside him was the shadowy figure. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The figure's face was still obscured, but she could see enough to know that they were real. They had been there with Blackwood when the mirror was still in his possession. She picked up the photograph and turned it over. On the back, someone had written a name, Malachi. Malachi. The name sent a shiver down her spine. Was that the shadowy figure's name? And if so, who were they? She set the photograph down and began to search the room for more clues. In one of the boxes, she found a stack of old letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were from Elias Blackwood to a man named Malachi. They spoke of the mirror, of its power, and of the curse that came with it. Blackwood believed that the mirror was a gateway to another world, a world of shadows and death. And he believed that Malachi was the key to controlling it. The mirror is not just a tool, Blackwood wrote in one letter. It is a living thing, and it must be fed. It feeds on fear, on despair, on death. And Malachi is its servant. He is the one who ensures that the curse is fulfilled. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the words. Malachi wasn't just a shadowy figure, he was the mirror's enforcer. He was the one who made sure the visions came true. She set the letters down and looked around the room. There had to be more. She needed to know how to stop Malachi, how to break the curse. And then she saw it, a small, leather-bound book tucked away on one of the shelves. She grabbed the book and opened it. Inside were notes and diagrams written in Blackwood's hand. They detailed rituals and incantations, ways to communicate with the mirror and, perhaps, to control it. And then, on the last page, she found what she had been looking for. To break the curse, Blackwood had written, the mirror must be destroyed. But it cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. It must be returned to the place of its creation, and the ritual must be performed. Only then can the curse be lifted. Eleanor's heart raced as she read the words. The mirror could be destroyed, but she had to take it back to where it was made. But where was that? And what was the ritual? She flipped through the book, looking for more information, but the pages were blank. The answer wasn't here. She would have to find it somewhere else. She took the photograph, the letters, and the book and climbed back up the stairs. As she reached the top, she felt a cold presence behind her. She turned, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness of the staircase. But she knew Malachi was watching, and he wouldn't let her go without a fight. Eleanor left the Blackwood estate with the photograph, the letters, and the leather-bound book clutched tightly in her hands. The weight of what she had discovered pressed down on her, but she felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the mirror had entered her life. There was a way to break the curse, she just had to find the mirror's place of creation and perform the ritual. But where was it? And what would the ritual require? She drove back to her apartment, her mind racing. The book contained notes on rituals, but the final page had been blank. She needed more information, and she had no idea where to find it. As she parked her car and walked up to her building, she felt a strange unease. The air felt heavier, colder, as if something was watching her. When she stepped into her apartment, the mirror was waiting. It stood in the corner of the room, its surface reflecting the dim light. She avoided looking at it directly, afraid of what she might see. Instead, she sat down at her desk and spread out the items she had taken from the darkroom. The photograph of Elias Blackwood and Malachi stared up at her. Malachi's face was still obscured, but she could feel his presence, cold and menacing. She turned her attention to the letters, reading through them again, searching for any clue she might have missed. In one of the letters, Blackwood mentioned a place called the Hollow. He described it as a remote, desolate location where the mirror had been forged. The hollow is a place of shadows, he wrote. It is where the veil between worlds is thinnest, where the mirror draws its power. Eleanor's heart raced. The hollow had to be the mirror's place of creation. But where was it? She searched online, but there was no record of a place by that name. Frustrated, she turned to the leather-bound book, hoping it might contain a map or directions. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On one of the diagrams, there was a small symbol in the corner, a circle with a line through it, the same symbol she had seen on the back of the mirror's frame. Beneath it were the words Locus Aeternum. Locus Aeternum. The eternal place. It had to be the hollow. She grabbed her laptop and searched for the term. After several minutes, she found a reference in an old, obscure text about occult geography. Locus Aeternum was described as a hidden place accessible only to those who knew the way. The text mentioned a series of landmarks that could lead to it, but the details were vague. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read. The landmarks were described as places of sorrow and despair, locations where great tragedies had occurred. She recognized one of them, a nearby forest where a terrible accident had happened decades ago. It was a start. She packed a bag with the items she had taken from the dark room, along with a few supplies, a flashlight, a knife, and a small bottle of salt she had read could be used for protection. She didn't know what she would face, but she couldn't go unprepared. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. And behind her, she saw the shadowy figure Malachi. He was closer than ever, his presence almost tangible. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck and spun around, but there was nothing there. "I'm coming for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm going to end this." She left the apartment and drove to the forest, her heart pounding with every mile. The sun was setting as she arrived, casting long shadows across the trees. She parked her car and began to walk, following the directions from the text. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under her feet. She felt as if she were being watched, but she forced herself to keep going. After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar covered in moss and vines. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This had to be the first landmark. She approached the altar and saw that it was carved with the same symbol, the crossed-out sun. She placed her hand on the stone and felt a strange energy, a pulse that seemed to resonate through her body. She continued through the forest, following the landmarks one by one. Each one brought her closer to the hollow, and each one filled her with a growing sense of dread. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and she felt Malachi's presence closing in. Finally, she reached the last landmark, a crumbling stone archway covered in ivy. Beyond the archway was a path that led into a deep, dark valley. The hollow. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped through the archway. The valley was shrouded in mist, the ground covered in dead leaves and twisted roots. At the center of the valley was a stone circle, and in the center of the circle was a pedestal. She approached the pedestal and saw that it was carved with the same symbol as the mirror. This was the place. She set the mirror down on the pedestal and opened the leather-bound book to the page with the ritual. The ritual required 3 things: a drop of her blood, a lock of her hair, and a spoken incantation. She pricked her finger with the knife and let a drop of blood fall onto the mirror's surface. Then she cut a small lock of her hair and placed it on the pedestal. She began to read the incantation, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger as she went. The words were in a language she didn't understand, but they felt heavy, powerful. As she spoke, the air around her seemed to vibrate and the mirror began to glow with a faint, eerie light. And then she felt it, a cold presence behind her. She turned and saw Malachi, his face finally visible. He was tall and gaunt, his eyes hollow and filled with malice. He reached out for her, his hand cold as ice. Eleanor stepped back, her heart pounding, but she didn't stop the incantation. She forced herself to keep speaking even as Malachi closed in. The mirror's glow grew brighter, and she felt a surge of energy, a force that seemed to push Malachi back. He snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You cannot escape," he said. "The mirror always claims its due." Eleanor's voice rose, the incantation reaching its climax. The mirror's glow became blinding, and she felt a wave of heat, a burst of light that seemed to consume everything. She closed her eyes, shielding her face, and when she opened them again, the mirror was gone. The pedestal was empty, the stone circle silent. Malachi was nowhere to be seen. The air was still, the mist beginning to clear. Eleanor sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. The mirror was destroyed, the curse broken. But as she sat there, she felt a strange emptiness, a sense of loss she couldn't explain. She stood up and made her way back through the forest, her mind still reeling. When she reached her car, she looked back at the archway one last time. The hollow was gone, swallowed by the shadows. She drove home in silence, the weight of what she had done settling over her. When she stepped into her apartment, the corner where the mirror had stood was empty. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of relief. The curse was over. She was free. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. And in the darkness, she thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice that sounded like Malachi's. "The mirror is eternal, and so am I.